federal building has been blown off.
Holy cow.
Ambulance tell IMSA there'll be a mass unit dispatch.
Tremendous blast came through the windows, blew us out of our chairs onto the floor.
24 acres, we're 97. We got damage and injuries all up and down Broadway.
I thank the Lord that I wasn't sitting at my desk at that time, because that portion of the building is gone.
Did every available infantry get fire everybody.
They are bringing people out that are just covered in blood. Ambulance crews have been arriving for the last 10 minutes, and they're going into the building.
The whole back of the building just fell in on us.
This one, we've got a lot of children.
April 19th, 1995. A rented truck pulled in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Not long after, the lethal mix of fertilizer and explosives detonated. 168 people died, over 600 were injured. Babies left safely at a daycare center were blown to pieces. It was at that time the deadliest act of terrorism within the United States, and it remains the most serious act of domestic terrorism in American history. On June 11th, 2001, 13 years ago today, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection for his role in this slaughter. 13 years later, we are faced with asking ourselves what we have learned and truly acted on since that day to find and stop these American-born terrorists who seem bent on killing as many people as they can, as often as they can, all in the name of some far-flung and all too often incomprehensible cause. Joining us here on Midpoint, he is an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he focuses on irregular warfare, terrorism, and global security. Colin Clarke. Thank you for joining us today, Colin.
Thanks for having me.
I get chills watching that and just seeing that video again from Oklahoma City for a number of reasons. I'm sure we all do. And I think the first question that everybody is going to ask as we look back at the execution of Timothy McVeigh on this day is, have we learned? Did we learn from that? And are we any better than we were then? Better off?
I think we're better with respect to certain counter-terrorist capabilities. I think it was really more of a post 9/11 phenomenon. We became hyper-aware of the threat of terrorism, not only global terrorism, transnational terrorism, but also the threat posed to the homeland by domestic terrorists or homegrown terrorists.
When we talk about homegrown terrorism, is it fair to say that no matter how much effort we put into it, no matter what we do, it is still the single biggest challenge perhaps in our own internal security is finding these people and identifying them before something happens?
Yeah, I mean, that remains a major challenge, and it will into the foreseeable future. We don't, despite what some people would lead you to believe, live in a security state. We still maintain a broad array of civil liberties. And the one thing I'd say about the homegrown threat is, while you led with the bombing in Oklahoma City and Timothy McVeigh, the threat of homegrown terrorism has grown more complex. I'd say it really folds into kind of two categories now. You have the homegrown jihadist threat that's linked into the broader Al-Qaeda or kind of global Salafist movement, and then there's the threat from, whether you want to call them far-right, right-wing militia-type groups, groups of the ilk that McVeigh was from.
Are we any better? I mean, you just broke it down, and I think that's proper the way you broke it down here, but are we any better at detecting one than we are the other? Do we focus more on one than the other? Where are we standing then in those? Because I want to bring this forward to today after what we have learned and see where we are now in making sure that we are able to at least stay ahead of this.
It's tough to apply metrics to say we're better now than we were then. The threat kind of is constant. Whether or not these threats manifest themselves into attacks, it really depends. And so, an interesting statistic put out by the New America Foundation was that since 9/11, right-wing extremist groups have actually killed more than jihadist-inspired groups. I think the kind of right-wing hate groups have tallied 37 deaths, while jihadist groups in this country only 21. So certainly, law enforcement remains vigilant. Joint Terrorism Task Force have proliferated. I think we're hyper aware at the federal, the state, the local level, constantly trying to gather intelligence. I think broader, larger government organizations like the NSA still continue to play a very important role and still do really important work in this area.
Here comes a tough question now. And as we go through all the investigative ways here to try and find out who these terrorists are on our own soil, there are civil liberties here in America. It is what we hold dear. But knowing what needs to be looked for, knowing what has to be done in order to find who these people are, is it really possible to stay a step ahead of the terrorists if we follow, and I'll get heat for this, but let's go there, if we follow to the letter the civil liberties and make sure that we are protecting everybody legally? Can we really learn everything we need to know?
Yeah, I think so. There's so much out there now on social media. People actually talk about their intentions more often than you'd think. And so I think being very vigilant on social media, some of the kind of FBI sting operations, which, those are, highly disputed by some people, but I think making sure that those don't kind of veer over into entrapment. They've still been effective in stopping terrorist plots against this country. But I think it is possible to remain within the letter of the law while still being effective, conducting counter-terrorist operations, conducting kind of non-kinetic or kind of left of the boom type of operations, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, things of that nature.
Now, what you're bringing up is all true. Now, we just saw some videotape of what went on in Las Vegas recently. Gerald Miller and his wife Amanda, the killing of 2 police officers here. As we learn a little bit more about this comes down to the homegrown right wing that you talk about, the extremists here. We now know that he was always going off, according to a friend, Jared was always going off spewing anti-government rants, filled his Facebook page with political cartoons that mocked police and other authorities. A recent post read, "We must prepare for war." He had said out loud, "The revolution has begun." So what can we do now, taking the lessons that we learned from Timothy McVeigh, who, of course, social media wasn't certainly as pervasive then as it is now. We didn't have all his rants out there. This was a very well-kept secret amongst a lot of people here. But taking the lessons of what we learned here and trying to get ahead of this, we're still missing. We seem to still be missing a lot of the signals that you just talked about that law enforcement supposedly should be right on top of. So that's what the general public wants to know. Why are we still missing them?
Well, you mentioned signals, and I'd say more aptly it's signals to noise ratio, right? And so for every guy like Miller that's out there, there are probably dozens that are saying the same things, but that are actually never going to do anything about it. So it's more about kind of identifying who these individuals are. And if they're going to make it easy for law enforcement by posting these things, great, let's take advantage of that. But it's difficult to stop every attack. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the maxim that we need to be right 100% of the time. Terrorists only need to be right once. And although that phrase is a bit hackneyed and well-worn, nevertheless, it remains true.
At the level of security that we're at today, and I know all we're going to do is do a supposition here now, but knowing what Timothy McVeigh went through, the rental of the vehicle, getting the ingredients that were out there, if we were at the level then that we are today and understanding homegrown terrorism, do you think we might have been able to catch this guy before it happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible because awareness plays a big part. That said, the World Trade Center was attacked in 1993, or it was attacked again in 2001. So clearly it was identified as a valuable target to groups that want to do the United States harm. So, I have a tough time believing that we'll be able to stop every attack. I think law enforcement to date has been highly successful in disrupting a lot of these attacks. If you think about it, there's been 40 plus terrorist attacks since 9/11 foiled by law enforcement, and only a handful that have actually succeeded. Several of which have been kind of these lone wolf attacks, or what my colleague Brian Michael Jenkins might call stray dog attacks. These kind of one-offs of people that intend to do harm, and it's very hard to stop one person or even a small cell of individuals hoping to inflict death and destruction.
About 30 seconds I have left. Is there a suggestion that you have, you study this, you know a little bit about this, that might be a good next step that maybe we haven't done?
Really what I'm concerned about right now is primarily some of this blowback that we could see from overseas. There's Americans overseas fighting in Syria, fighting in Iraq. And if these individuals come home and slip under the radar of law enforcement, that could pose major potential problems in the future, because there you have capability of some of these terrorists who have learned the tradecraft, and you certainly have intent, and that's a deadly mixture.
Unfortunately, we're going to be talking about this for a long time to come, unfortunately. Colin Clarke, thank you so much for joining us. Excellent insight, and I hope we do this again, but let's do it and try and prevent some of this instead next time. Thank you very much. It is a difficult anniversary to remember. Here's a good line, too, when they're talking about the fact that embrace violent extremism, watching al-Qaeda propaganda on computers. These are the people that don't raise a lot of flags. A little vigilance never hurt anybody. We will, of course, remain vigilant here. This is Midpoint, where every day we question everything.